The cabin had always been more than just a place to stay. It was a retreat, a sanctuary nestled deep in the pines where the air was cleaner and the silence was broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. For decades, the property had been kept in pristine condition by its owner, who treasured not only the cabin itself, but also the land that surrounded it. With its wooden deck overlooking a private clearing, the cabin felt untouchable, far removed from the noise of suburbia and the overbearing influence of homeowner associations that so often turn neighbors against each other. But one morning, as the sun rose and the mist lifted from the clearing, something unusual appeared at the front gate. A sleek white SUV rolled slowly down the gravel path, its tires crunching loudly in the stillness. Behind it came a second car, then a third, all pulling into the wide opening by the fence. This wasn't the occasional lost traveler or a delivery gone astray. These were professionals, dressed neatly with polished shoes that looked out of place in the dust and dirt. They stepped out of their vehicles with clipboards in hand, their eyes scanning the property with a hungry sort of curiosity. At first, it wasn't clear who they were. But then the familiar branded signs came out of the SUV trunk, bold red and white colors, the unmistakable logo of a real estate agency. Stakes were hammered into the ground with efficient motions. A large sign was soon propped up just outside the gate. The lettering was unmistakable. For sale. The cabin's owner stood at the window in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. No one had listed this property for sale. No realtor had been called. Yet here they were, acting with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be there. The explanation came soon enough. Alongside the realtors was another familiar presence, the president of the local homeowners association, a woman with a reputation that stretched across the community like a shadow. Known for her rigid interpretation of rules and her relentless desire for control, she often behaved as though she alone dictated the future of every home in the neighborhood. And now, she stood at the gate, speaking with the agents, gesturing at the cabin with a flourish, as if the entire property belonged to her to sell. The HOA president had always been dismissive of the cabin. She claimed it was out of place, too. Rustic, compared to the polished modern homes that had begun to appear nearby. Where others saw character and charm, she saw an obstacle to her vision of a perfect neighborhood, one that she could showcase to prospective buyers with pride. And now it was clear she had taken matters into her own hands, crossing a line no one thought she would dare cross. The realtors wandered further down the gravel path, taking pictures, pointing toward the deck, and scribbling notes about square footage, potential upgrades, and resale value. The cabin, untouched and private for so long, was being picked apart like merchandise in a store window. It wasn't just offensive, it was deeply unsettling. The HOA president moved as though orchestrating the entire performance, waving her hands toward the woods as if to highlight the privacy and natural beauty of the property. She spoke animatedly about its potential and market appeal. The realtors nodded along, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that none of this was sanctioned by the rightful owner. Inside, the cabin's owner felt anger beginning to replace the shock. The HOA had overstepped countless times before. Complaints about firewood being stacked too high, warnings about grass growing an inch above the limit, even petty notes left about the color of outdoor chairs. But this was something entirely different. This was theft disguised as authority. This was an attempt to erase ownership altogether. Determined to put an end to the intrusion, the owner stepped outside. The gravel crunched underfoot as he approached the gate. The realtors glanced up briefly, polite but distracted, still in their rhythm of photographing and jotting down notes. The HOA president, however, froze, her expression flickering between irritation and surprise. She hadn't expected to be confronted, not like this, not so soon. The air between them grew tense. Without words, the message was clear. This property was not for sale, and these people had no right to be here. Yet the HOA president held her posture, stubborn and unyielding, as if daring the owner to challenge her authority in front of the outsiders she had brought. The moment stretched on, and the owner made a decision. He turned, walked back to the cabin, and returned moments later with a large iron key in hand. The chain-link gate, which had been swung wide open by the visitors, clanged shut as the key turned in the lock. The sound was sharp and final, echoing through the trees. The vehicles parked just inside the boundary were now trapped unless allowed to leave. The realtors exchanged uneasy looks, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a scheduled tour. This wasn't even a legal listing. They had walked into something far more complicated than a property showing. Slowly, they began to retreat, gathering their materials and heading back toward their vehicles, uncertain of what would happen next. But the HOA president lingered, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the owner with a mixture of frustration and disdain. She muttered under her breath, clutching her clipboard tightly before storming off toward her car. She had been challenged, humiliated even, but there was little she could do in that moment except retreat. As the convoy of cars backed out of the gravel path and disappeared beyond the trees, silence returned to the clearing. The only thing left behind was the bold "For Sale" sign, still planted firmly in the ground just outside the locked gate. The cabin's owner stood before it for a long moment, studying the insult of its presence, before finally pulling it from the soil and tossing it aside. It was then that a new idea began to form. If the HOA thought they could sell the cabin, then perhaps it was time to remind them, and everyone else, that ownership was not up for debate. A sign of his own would be posted, not to invite buyers, but to send a message, one that would leave no room for misinterpretation. And so, with frustration still simmering but determination beginning to take shape, the owner began planning his next move. The battle had only just begun. The morning after the confrontation, the cabin's clearing felt different. The air was cool and still, but beneath that calmness was a heavy awareness, an anticipation of what would come next. The HOA president had left the property humiliated, but she was not the type to surrender quietly. Her absence didn't signal defeat. It meant she was regrouping, plotting her next attempt to assert control. The cabin's owner understood this all too well. Years of living under the HOA's thumb had revealed a pattern. Every time the president lost, she came back twice as determined. That meant the cabin, as private and independent as it felt, was not truly safe from her reach. Not yet. That morning, with the unwanted realtor sign now discarded, a new sign was carefully crafted. It wasn't flashy or decorative, but its message was blunt, unmissable, and final. Large black letters were painted across a sturdy wooden board, the strokes heavy and deliberate. Private property. Not for sale. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The board was mounted to the gate itself, nailed firmly so that no one could remove it without effort. It was a declaration, a counterstrike to the HOA's brazen stunt. If they wanted to confuse buyers into thinking the cabin was available, that illusion ended here. Anyone who drove by the gate would see the truth before they even had the chance to ask questions. Once it was in place, the owner stood back to admire it. Against the rustic backdrop of the cabin's gravel path, the sign looked almost aggressive, like a guard dog stationed at the entrance. And in a way, that's exactly what it was, a deterrent against further intrusion. But deterrence alone wasn't enough. Experience with the HOA had shown that rules and warnings were meaningless to them when they believed their vision mattered more. They had rewritten policies before, twisted bylaws, even fabricated violations just to get their way. It was only a matter of time before they tried again. The next few days confirmed that suspicion. At first, there was quiet, an eerie lull in the constant noise of HOA harassment. But soon, whispers started circulating through the neighborhood. A few neighbors stopped by the gate, curious about the new sign. Some tilted their heads, squinting as they read the words aloud before shaking their heads in disbelief. Others took out their phones, snapping pictures as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. The HOA president had apparently told her circle that the cabin was a distressed property, owned by someone looking to get out, but too stubborn to admit it. She had painted a story where the sign wasn't defiance, it was desperation. According to her, the cabin's owner was clinging to a place he couldn't afford to maintain, resisting the inevitable sale that would benefit everyone. Those who knew the truth scoffed, but not everyone knew. And in HOA communities, rumors spread faster than facts. Soon, more realtors began circling the area, some discreet, others bold enough to drive slowly past the gate, rolling down their windows to take a closer look. The sign stopped most of them, but not all. A few even dared to leave business cards, tucked into the gate as if ignoring the warning would somehow change reality. Each card collected was a reminder of the HOA's persistence. The president had opened a door, and now opportunists were walking through it, believing there was money to be made. One afternoon, the inevitable happened. A small group of prospective buyers arrived. Unlike the realtors before, they came as a family, their minivan pulling to a stop right outside the gate. Two adults stepped out, followed by children who ran to the edge of the gravel, peering curiously at the sign. The parents seemed confused, exchanging hushed words as they compared the bold warning on the gate with the listing they had apparently been shown online. That discovery hit harder than expected. The property wasn't just being toured by realtors anymore. It was being advertised. Somewhere, somehow, the HOA president had fed enough information to someone to create an actual online listing. It was no longer an abstract threat. It was active, public, and dangerous. The cabin's owner wasted no time. Evidence needed to be collected before it could disappear. The family was approached, politely but firmly informed that the property was not, and never had been, for sale. They looked embarrassed, apologizing for the misunderstanding, explaining that the listing seemed official. When pressed, they gave the name of the agent who had shown them the link. That name was written down. Later that evening, after the family left, hours were spent scouring real estate websites, and there it was, photos of the cabin, clearly taken without permission, uploaded under a listing that described the property as a rustic getaway ready for new ownership. The square footage was inaccurate, the price laughably low, but the damage was real. The HOA president's fingerprints were all over it, even if her name wasn't. Seeing the cabin exploited like that, reduced to a commodity in someone else's scheme, was infuriating, but it also presented an opportunity. Evidence had been gathered. The false listing was documented with screenshots, dates, and names. Business cards left by realtors were photographed and cataloged. Even the family's testimony, though informal, was a thread that could be followed. The HOA president had crossed into illegal territory, and for the first time, there was proof. The next step was clear. Escalation, quiet warnings, and locked gates were no longer enough. This was no longer a petty dispute over lawn length or paint color. This was fraud, and fraud required accountability. That night, plans were made. Calls would be placed in the morning, first to the listing website, demanding removal of the false advertisement, then to the realtor's office, requesting explanations, and finally, if necessary, to legal counsel. The HOA had always played games with power, but this was the kind of game that could cost them everything. Still, even as plans took shape, unease lingered. The HOA president wasn't the type to retreat when threatened. If she realized she had been caught, she would only fight harder, pulling strings, spreading lies, dragging others into her scheme. The battle wasn't over. It was only evolving. The cabin's owner prepared for a long fight ahead. One thought remained at the forefront. The HOA had underestimated how far their victim was willing to go. They thought they could intimidate, manipulate, and deceive. But they were about to learn what real resistance looked like, and the first move in that resistance was already nailed to the gate, staring back at every car that passed. The next morning began with phone calls. The cabin's owner, armed with screenshots and collected evidence, wasted no time. The first call went to the real estate website that had been hosting the fraudulent listing. A calm but firm explanation was given. The property was privately owned, never authorized for sale, and had been listed without consent. Screenshots of the false information and proof of ownership were provided, and the website promised to investigate immediately. Though the representative sounded apologetic, there was no disguising the fact that damage had already been done. The listing had been live for days. People had seen it, families had toured the property, and realtors had distributed the address. Even if it was taken down, the ripple effect would linger. The second call was to the realtor whose name had been connected to the family's visit. That conversation was less straightforward. The agent claimed they had received the property details from a trusted community contact and assumed everything was legitimate. When pressed for specifics, the agent reluctantly admitted that the contact was none other than the HOA president. That revelation was both shocking and validating. It confirmed what had been suspected from the beginning. The president had not only misled realtors, but had deliberately impersonated the owner's intent. She had orchestrated the entire scheme, weaving a false narrative to make the cabin seem like a distressed, desperate sale. The realtor, realizing their own liability, promised to withdraw from the matter entirely. But the damage had already been cemented, and the web of lies was now traceable back to the HOA. The final call that morning was to a local attorney. The words felt heavy as they were spoken aloud. My property was fraudulently listed for sale by my HOA. It was an unusual case, but not unheard of. The attorney confirmed that if the evidence was as strong as it seemed, there were grounds for both civil and possibly criminal action. Fraud, misrepresentation, trespassing, each carried serious consequences. A meeting was scheduled, and the collected evidence was neatly organized into a folder, ready to be presented. But if the cabin's owner had hoped for peace in the meantime, that hope was short-lived. By the afternoon, the retaliation began. It started with letters. Brightly colored envelopes appeared in the mailbox, each stamped with the HOA's logo. Inside were violation notices, citing absurd infractions, improper fencing materials, excessive vegetation near the property line, and unapproved signage, referring, of course, to the bold warning nailed to the gate. The language was sharp, threatening fines and mandatory compliance hearings. The letters were clearly retaliatory, desperate attempts to reassert authority after being exposed. But they also served as a warning. The HOA president knew she had been caught, and now she was lashing out in every way she could. Soon after, neighbors began whispering. Passing cars slowed near the gate, their occupants glancing toward the cabin as if expecting to see drama unfold at any moment. Some waved in quiet solidarity, others looked away, embarrassed by the spectacle. Rumors were spreading fast. The HOA president, refusing to accept defeat, was painting herself as the victim of an unreasonable homeowner who refused to cooperate for the good of the community. Her version of the story was absurd, but in HOA neighborhoods, appearances often mattered more than truth, and she was skilled at manipulating appearances. That evening, while walking the perimeter of the property, the owner noticed something unsettling. Footprints, fresh ones. They weren't the usual patterns left by deer or foxes. These were distinct. Human, pressed deep into the dirt just inside the fence line. Someone had been trespassing again, despite the locked gate and the warning sign. It was clear. Intimidation had begun. The HOA wasn't going to stop with paperwork and rumors. They wanted to push harder, to make the cabin's owner feel vulnerable, even unsafe. The following day confirmed that fear. A letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from the county office. It was a notice of a complaint about alleged zoning violations on the property. Someone had reported that the cabin was being used as a rental without permits. It was a baseless claim, but it triggered an official inspection notice. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The HOA president, realizing her scheme was unraveling, was weaponizing local authorities to create pressure. She wanted the cabin's owner distracted, drained, and overwhelmed, but what she hadn't accounted for was the owner's growing determination. Every violation letter, every false complaint, every trespass was meticulously documented. Copies were made, photos were taken, timestamps recorded. The file of evidence was growing thicker by the day. What had started as a folder was now expanding into a binder, each page a nail in the HOA's coffin. At the same time, small acts of defiance became part of daily life. The warning sign on the gate was reinforced with extra bolts. A camera was mounted discreetly above the clearing, its lens angled toward the entrance. Motion lights were installed, casting bright floods of light across the path whenever someone approached after dark. If they wanted to sneak around, they would now be caught in the spotlight. The cabin, once simply a sanctuary, was transforming into a fortress. Still, with each new measure of protection, the tension grew heavier. The owner knew the HOA president wasn't finished. She thrived on control, and control slipping away would only fuel her obsession. Every move she made now would be bolder, more reckless. And then, one evening, the confrontation came again. It was just past dusk when headlights appeared on the road leading to the gate. A single vehicle this time, a glossy black sedan that idled for a long moment before the door opened. The HOA president stepped out, clipboard in hand, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. She walked straight to the gate, ignoring the bold sign, and stood there staring toward the cabin. She didn't shout, didn't knock, didn't call out. She simply stood, as if daring the owner to approach. The standoff lasted several minutes, the only sound the low hum of her idling engine. Behind her. Finally, she scribbled something onto her clipboard, tucked it under her arm, and returned to her car. Without a word, the sedan rolled back down the road and disappeared into the night. The owner remained on the porch, watching until the taillights were gone. Whatever she had written down would surface soon enough. Another notice, another false claim, another attempt to grind away at resolve. But what she hadn't realized was that every step she took was tightening the trap she had walked into. Every false violation, every fraudulent listing, every trespass, each was becoming part of a larger case, and when the time came to strike back, it wouldn't just be a defense. It would be an offense so complete that the HOA president would finally see her empire collapse. The war was no longer about a single cabin. It had become a test of endurance, of truth against manipulation, of individual ownership against manufactured authority, and both sides were preparing for the next blow. The following week unfolded like a storm gathering strength. The HOA president had been humiliated, exposed for manipulating realtors, and her attempt to stage a sale had failed. Yet instead of retreating, she doubled down. For her, losing was never an option. The first signs of escalation arrived in the form of official letters, not from the HOA but from outside agencies. Someone, obviously the HOA president, had filed a string of complaints with the county. Each one was designed to trigger an investigation: alleged zoning violations, noise complaints, improper land use, even accusations of environmental damage, from firewood stored too close to the cabin. One by one, inspectors began arriving at the property. They were polite but firm, explaining that they were required to follow up on the complaints. The cabin's owner escorted them through the grounds, presenting permits, receipts, and proof of compliance at every turn. Each time, the inspectors left satisfied, but the interruptions were exhausting. It was harassment disguised as bureaucracy, and it was working exactly as the HOA president intended. She wanted the cabin's owner to feel cornered, overwhelmed by constant scrutiny, drained by the effort of defending against false accusations. But what she hadn't accounted for was resilience. Every inspector who arrived was met with professionalism. Every complaint was answered with documentation. And every visit was logged, copied, and stored in the growing binder of evidence. The owner wasn't breaking under the pressure. He was building a case stronger than anything the HOA president could have imagined. Still, the pressure weighed heavy. Nights became restless, each creak of the cabin raising questions of whether someone was lurking outside. The newly installed motion lights flickered often, triggered by movement near the fence. Sometimes it was just deer, but sometimes the camera footage revealed shadowy figures standing too close for comfort. Trespassers, watching, waiting. It was intimidation in its rawest form. And then came the most brazen move yet. On a Friday afternoon, while the cabin's owner was away in town, a group of HOA board members arrived with the president at the helm. Together, they hauled new metal stakes and a large sign of their own. By the time the owner returned, it was already planted just outside the property line, bold letters declaring community property, future development site. The words hit like a punch to the chest. It wasn't just another lie. It was a direct attempt to erase ownership altogether, to claim the cabin and the land as something belonging to the HOA itself. The audacity was staggering. Neighbors driving. I slowed to read the sign, their expressions caught between disbelief and curiosity. To the uninformed, it looked official, legitimate even. That was the breaking point. The owner pulled the sign out of the ground, dragging it into the clearing, and tossing it aside like garbage. But this time, there was no satisfaction in removing it. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was theft attempted in plain sight. That night, sitting at the kitchen table beneath the dim light of a single lamp, the owner opened the thick binder of evidence. Pages of screenshots, violation letters, complaint notices, realtor cards, and photographs of trespassers filled the binder until it barely closed. Each piece told part of the story, but together they revealed the full picture, a deliberate campaign of fraud, harassment, and intimidation. The decision was made then. Enough was enough. The HOA president had declared war, and it was time to end it. The next morning, the owner met with the attorney face to face. The binder was laid out on the polished wooden desk, page by page reviewed and cataloged. The attorney's expression hardened with each passing document, each photograph, each record of harassment. By the time the binder was closed, there was no doubt. This wasn't just a civil matter. This was criminal. The attorney explained the options carefully. A civil lawsuit could be filed for harassment, defamation, and fraud. Criminal charges could be pursued for the false real estate listing, trespassing, and attempts at misrepresentation. The county, already frustrated with repeated false complaints, would likely cooperate. And if neighbors were willing to testify about the false rumors, the HOA president's credibility would collapse. It would take time, patience, and persistence. But victory was possible. The plan was simple but powerful. Move forward legally, publicly, and decisively. No more quiet resistance. No more tolerating petty harassment. It was time to take the fight to the HOA's doorstep. As preparations were made, word began spreading through the neighborhood. The HOA president, sensing she was losing ground, ramped up her propaganda. She held meetings, spinning wild tales about the cabin being illegally built, about the owner being a squatter refusing to comply with community standards. She insisted that selling the property was in everyone's best interest. But not everyone believed her anymore. Some neighbors, tired of her overreach, began voicing support for the cabin's owner. They knew the truth. They had seen the realtors come and go, the signs planted without permission, the endless violation letters. Whispers began turning into open frustration. Some even suggested voting her out as president, a threat she had never faced before. The HOA president was losing her grip, and in her desperation, she made one final reckless move. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, she returned to the gate. This time, she wasn't alone. Two other board members accompanied her carrying tools. They cut through the chain on the gate, forcing it open, and stepped onto the property as though it belonged to them. Cameras hidden in the trees caught everything, their flashlights sweeping across the path, their figures moving closer toward the cabin. But what they didn't know was that the owner was home. From the porch, lights flicked on, blinding them. The sound of a camera shutter clicked in the still night air. Startled, they froze, caught in the act, no excuses left to hide behind. After a long, tense moment, they retreated, muttering angrily as they stumbled back to their car. The footage was clear, undeniable. That was the final piece of evidence. The next morning, the attorney was called again. With video proof of trespassing, the case had shifted from harassment to outright criminal activity. Law enforcement could now be involved, directly. The HOA president had crossed a line she couldn't walk back from. The war had reached its peak. One final step remained, exposing the truth in full daylight, where no rumor, no manipulation, no intimidation could conceal what the HOA president had done. And as preparations for legal action began in earnest, the cabin's owner realized something profound. The battle wasn't just about one property anymore. It was about setting an example, proving that even the most controlling HOA president could be held accountable. And soon, that accountability would arrive. The morning the case was filed marked the beginning of the end. The binder of evidence, now overflowing, was delivered into the hands of law enforcement and the attorney overseeing the matter. Within days, official notices were sent to the HOA board and subpoenas were issued. The president, once untouchable in her self-made kingdom, was suddenly thrust into a reality where her actions were no longer rumor and intimidation. They were matters of law. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. For years, the president had reigned unchecked, her control cemented through fear of fines, violation notices, and endless bureaucracy. Many homeowners had complied simply to avoid conflict. But now, someone had fought back, and not just with words or small acts of defiance. The cabin's owner had armed himself with undeniable proof, and the legal system had taken notice. The first blow landed quickly. The fraudulent real estate listing, backed by screenshots, was traced back to the HOA president's communications with a local realtor. While she had never put her own name on the documents, emails revealed her involvement. She had provided photographs, taken during unauthorized visits, and supplied fabricated details about the property. Her attempt to remain in the shadows collapsed under the weight of her digital trail. The second blow came with the video evidence. Footage of the president and two board members trespassing onto private property under the cover of darkness played, like a crime reel. The flashlights, the sound of tools clipping the chain, the moment they froze under the floodlight, it was undeniable. Even those in the community who had once defended her could not explain it away. Trespassing was trespassing, and they had been caught in the act. The third blow was the thick binder itself, letters of harassment, violation notices citing imaginary infractions, and false complaints filed with the county. Individually, they might have seemed petty. Together, they painted a picture of obsession, an abuse of power so blatant that it bordered on vendetta. The attorney presented it all in sequence, laying bare the campaign the HOA president had waged to force a private homeowner out of his own cabin. The legal proceedings moved quickly, fueled by the mountain of evidence. Civil suits for harassment, defamation, and fraud were filed. At the same time, law enforcement pursued criminal charges of trespassing, misrepresentation, and attempted fraud. The HOA president, once feared for her authority, now found herself on the defensive, scrambling to explain actions that were recorded, documented, and undeniable. For the cabin's owner, the process was exhausting. Court appearances, depositions, and endless paperwork consumed the weeks that followed. But each step forward brought progress. Each hearing, each filing, each ruling chipped away at the HOA president's control. Neighbors watched closely. Some whispered words of encouragement when passing the gate, while others, previously silent, began to distance themselves from the HOA board entirely. The illusion of the president's untouchable power was crumbling, and in its place was a realization that her reign had always been built on fear, not legitimacy. The board itself fractured. A few members resigned, unwilling to sync with the president. Others scrambled to protect themselves, claiming they had been misled or pressured into compliance. What had once been a unified force of intimidation became a scattered collection of individuals desperate to save their own reputations. And then came the turning point, the day of the public hearing. In a room filled with homeowners, attorneys, and county officials, the case was laid bare. The fraudulent listing was displayed on a projector, the bold "For Sale" sign outside the cabin shown in photographs, and finally the video footage of the late-night trespass played for everyone to see. Gasps filled the room as neighbors recognized the figures on screen. Their own HOA president and board members caught red-handed. There was no defense strong enough to withstand the evidence. The president tried to spin her actions as concern for the community, claiming the cabin was unsafe and that her interventions were justified. But her words fell flat. The proof was too clear, her lies too transparent. For the first time, she looked small, cornered, desperate, and powerless. The rulings came swiftly. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for harassment and legal fees. The president herself faced criminal penalties, her position on the board stripped permanently. The county dismissed all false complaints against the cabin, clearing the owner of any wrongdoing. And perhaps most satisfying of all, the HOA's authority was severely restricted, with new oversight imposed to prevent such abuses from ever happening again. The cabin's gate, once a battleground of signs and trespasses, now stood as a quiet symbol of victory. The bold, "Private property not for sale" sign still hung proudly, not as a warning to opportunists, but as a reminder of a fight won. Neighbors passed by with newfound respect, some offering small nods or waves, acknowledging the courage it had taken to stand up against the president's tyranny. Life at the cabin slowly returned to normal. The forest regained its silence, broken only by the rustle of wind and the calls of distant birds. The cameras and motion lights remained, not out of fear, but as a precaution, a reminder that vigilance was necessary in a world where control could be abused so easily. But the greatest change was not in the property itself, it was in the community. Where once there had been silence and submission, there was now awareness. The downfall of the president proved that no one, not even the most powerful HOA leader, was above accountability. Neighbors who had lived in quiet resentment now found their voices, demanding fair treatment and transparency. The board, once a tool of control, began to function as it should have all along, serving the people, not ruling them. For the cabin's owner, the fight had been long and draining, but in the end, it had been worth it. The property was safe, the lies dismantled, and the president's empire destroyed. The cabin remained what it had always been, a sanctuary, a home, a place that belonged to no one but him. And as the sun set behind the pines, casting golden light across the clearing, one truth stood clear. The HOA had tried to take everything, but instead, they had lost everything. The cabin stood unshaken, and so did its owner.